In 1867, Virginia, a father sealed his own sons in the cellar, their cries swallowed by the dark. Days passed, but when the door was finally opened, what emerged was nothing anyone could explain. Marcus Whitmore had always been drawn to forgotten places, but the estate sale at the old Bramblewood Manor felt different from the moment he stepped through its weathered doors. The Victorian mansion had stood empty for decades, its windows like hollow eyes watching over the Virginia countryside. As a freelance journalist specializing in historical mysteries, Marcus made his living uncovering stories that time had tried to bury. But something about this place made his skin crawl in ways he couldn't quite explain. The house belonged to the recently deceased Eleanor Blackthorne, the last surviving member of a family that had once owned vast stretches of farmland in the region. According to the estate lawyer, she had been a recluse for the better part of 40 years, rarely venturing beyond her property's iron gates. The sale was poorly advertised, drawing only a handful of antique dealers and curiosity seekers who picked through dusty furniture and moth-eaten linens with little enthusiasm. Marcus found himself gravitating toward the manor's library, a cavernous room lined with towering bookshelves that reached toward a coffered ceiling. Most of the volumes were water-damaged or falling apart, their leather bindings cracked like ancient skin. He was examining a collection of local historical texts when his fingers brushed against something tucked between two particularly thick volumes. It was a photograph, sepia-toned and roughly the size of his palm, its edges yellowed with age. The image showed 3 young boys, perhaps between the ages of 8 and 12, standing in what appeared to be a cellar or basement. The lighting was poor, creating deep shadows that seemed to swallow the edges of the frame, but Marcus could make out stone walls and what looked like wooden shelves lined with preserving jars. The boys were dressed in simple clothing that suggested the photograph had been taken sometime in the late 1800s. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes wide with what Marcus initially took to be fear, though something about their expressions suggested something far more complex, a mixture of terror, pleading, and resignation that made his stomach turn. What struck Marcus most forcefully was not just the boys' haunted appearance, but the setting itself. The cellar looked wrong somehow, as if it had been hastily prepared or modified. Behind the children, he could see what appeared to be fresh mortar between stones, and the wooden shelves seemed oddly placed, as if they were meant to conceal rather than organize. Most unsettling of all was a detail he almost missed. Scratches in the stone wall, visible just at the edge of the frame, marks that looked disturbingly like they had been made by human fingernails. Marcus turned the photograph over and found an inscription written in faded ink. Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell, Winter of Sorrows, 1867. Below that, in a different hand and darker ink, someone had added, "May God forgive what necessity demanded." The writing sent a chill down Marcus's spine, but it was the final line, scrawled in pencil as if added much later, that made his hands tremble. They never came up from below. He looked around the library, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. The other sale attendees seemed to have moved to different rooms, and Marcus could hear their muffled voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the manor. He studied the photograph again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The boys' positioning looked staged, as if someone had carefully arranged them for the camera, but their expressions were too genuine, too filled with raw emotion, to be mere performance. Marcus had covered enough historical mysteries to recognize when he'd stumbled onto something significant. The date, 1867, placed the photograph during the period immediately following the Civil War, when Virginia and much of the South were struggling with economic devastation and widespread famine. The reference to Winter of Sorrows suggested these were particularly hard times. But what could have necessitated photographing 3 terrified children in what appeared to be a makeshift prison? As he continued to examine the image, Marcus noticed other disturbing details. The boys' clothes, while shabby, seemed too large for their frames, hanging loose, as if they had recently lost significant weight. Their positioning suggested they were trying to stay close together for comfort. But there was something else, a sense that they were backed against the wall, not by choice, but by circumstance. The more he studied their faces, the more convinced he became that these children knew exactly what was happening to them and understood there would be no escape. The photograph raised more questions than it answered, but Marcus knew he had found something extraordinary. Historical photographs of children were relatively common, but this image carried an emotional weight that spoke of genuine tragedy. The technical quality was surprisingly good for the period, suggesting the photographer had been skilled and deliberate in their work. This wasn't a casual family portrait or documentation of daily life. This was something else entirely, something that someone had felt compelled to record, despite its obvious disturbing nature. Marcus carefully tucked the photograph into his jacket pocket and approached the estate sale coordinator, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, who was cataloging items in a thick ledger. When he asked about purchasing the photograph, she looked at him with confusion, claiming she had no record of any photographs being included in the sale. According to her manifest, the library contained only books and a few pieces of furniture. Marcus didn't press the issue, simply thanked her and moved on. But her reaction troubled him. How could such a significant item not be included in the official inventory? As he prepared to leave Bramblewood Manor, Marcus took one last look around the library. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows created patterns on the floor that reminded him uncomfortably of prison bars. He found himself wondering about Eleanor Blackthorne and why she had chosen to live alone in this vast, empty house for so many years. Had she known about the photograph? Had she been the one to hide it between those books, keeping it safe from prying eyes while ensuring it would eventually be found by someone who might understand its significance? Walking back to his car, Marcus felt the weight of the photograph against his chest, like a burning coal. He had made his career by investigating historical mysteries, but this felt different, more personal, more urgent. The faces of those 3 boys seemed burned into his memory, their silent plea for help echoing across more than a century and a half. As a journalist, he knew he had a responsibility to uncover the truth, but as a human being, he wondered if some truths were too terrible to bring to light. The drive back to his apartment in Richmond was a blur of autumn countryside and racing thoughts. Marcus kept thinking about the inscription on the back of the photograph, particularly the line about necessity and forgiveness. What kind of necessity could have justified whatever had happened to Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell? The winter of 1867 had been notoriously harsh throughout Virginia, with crop failures and supply shortages causing widespread suffering. But surely nothing could have warranted what the photograph seemed to suggest. By the time Marcus reached his apartment, he had made his decision. The photograph represented more than just a historical curiosity. It was evidence of something that demanded investigation. The boys in that cellar deserved to have their story told, regardless of how dark that story might prove to be. As he carefully placed the photograph on his desk under a bright lamp, studying every detail one more time, Marcus felt the familiar thrill of a mystery beginning to unfold. Tomorrow, I find out what really happened in that cellar. Marcus's first stop the following morning was the Virginia Historical Society's archives in Richmond, where he hoped to find records relating to the Hartwell family and the winter of 1867. The Society's research librarian, Dr. Patricia Chen, was a longtime colleague who had helped him with numerous investigations over the years. When Marcus showed her the photograph, her usual professional composure faltered for just a moment, her eyes widening as she took in the disturbing image. "My God, Marcus," she whispered, handling the photograph with trembling fingers. "Where did you find this?" When he explained about the estate sale at Bramblewood Manor, Doctor, Chen's expression grew even more troubled. She had heard of the Blackthorne family, she told him, though their history was largely undocumented in the Society's official records. What she did know painted a picture of a family that had once been prominent in the region, but had gradually withdrawn from public life, following some kind of scandal in the late 1800s. The search for records proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. While the Historical Society had extensive documentation from the post-Civil War period, specific information about the Hartwell family was surprisingly sparse. What they did find was troubling. A brief mention in a local newspaper from March 1868 reporting that Ezekiel Hartwell, a widowed farmer, had moved away from his property near the small community of Millbrook after suffering the loss of his 3 sons during the harsh winter. The article provided no details about how the boys had died, referring only to the terrible circumstances that befell the family during those dark months. Dr. Chen also located a property deed showing that Ezekiel Hartwell's farm had been sold to the Blackthorne family in April 1868, just weeks after the newspaper report. The sale price was listed as significantly below market value, suggesting either financial desperation or unusual circumstances surrounding the transaction. Most intriguing was a notation in the deed's margin, written in the same hand as the official document, "Cellar to remain sealed, as per agreement with Cellar." As Marcus studied these documents, he began to piece together a timeline that made his blood run cold. The photograph was dated to the winter of 1867, specifically described as the Winter of Sorrows. The boys had allegedly died during this same period, but their father hadn't sold the property and left the area until several months later. What had Ezekiel Hartwell been doing during those intervening months? And why had the sale agreement specifically mentioned keeping the cellar sealed? Dr. Chen helped Marcus access additional resources, including military records and census data from the period. They discovered that Ezekiel Hartwell had served in the Confederate Army and returned home in late 1865 to find his farm in ruins and his wife dead from disease. The 1866 census listed him as living alone with his 3 sons, Thomas, age 12, William, age 10, and Samuel, age 8. By the 1870 census, there was no record of any Hartwell family members in the entire county. The more Marcus learned about the historical context, the more disturbing the photograph became. The winter of 1866 to 1867 had indeed been catastrophic for much of Virginia, with crop failures leading to widespread famine. Contemporary accounts described families subsisting on bark soup and boiled leather, with reports of people dying of starvation becoming commonplace. Federal relief efforts were minimal, leaving many communities to fend for themselves during one of the most difficult periods in the region's history. Marcus found himself wondering what kind of desperation could have driven a father to do whatever Ezekiel Hartwell had done to his sons. The phrase, "what necessity demanded" from the photograph's inscription took on an increasingly sinister meaning as he considered the historical context. Had starvation driven the man to madness? The thought was almost too horrible to contemplate, but Marcus had seen enough historical tragedies to know that extreme circumstances could push people to unthinkable acts. His next step was to visit the actual location where the Hartwell farm had once stood. Using the property descriptions from the historical deeds, Marcus was able to determine that the land was now part of a much larger estate about 20 miles southwest of Richmond. The current owner, according to county records, was a development company planning to build a subdivision on the property. Marcus called their offices and arranged to visit the site, claiming to be researching local history for a potential book project. The drive to the former Hartwell property took Marcus through rolling countryside that had changed dramatically since the 1860s. What had once been individual family farms were now consolidated into larger agricultural operations, or had been sold to developers. As he turned onto the gravel road that led to the old farmstead, Marcus felt an unexpected sense of dread settling over him. The trees seemed to close in around his car, and the autumn afternoon suddenly felt much colder than it had just minutes before. The development company's representative, a cheerful young man named Kevin Mitchell, met Marcus at the site and proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about the property's history. He confirmed that there had indeed been an old farmhouse on the land, though it had been demolished decades earlier when the property was first consolidated. What remained, he explained, were the stone foundations and what appeared to be the remains of a root cellar that had been sealed with concrete sometime in the distant past. Marcus's heart began racing as Kevin led him to where the old farmhouse had stood. The foundation stones were still visible, overgrown with vines, and partially buried by decades of accumulated soil and debris. But it was the sealed cellar entrance that commanded Marcus's attention. A concrete cap, weathered and cracked with age, covered what had clearly once been stone steps leading underground. Around the edges of the concrete, Marcus could see the original stonework, expertly fitted but somehow ominous in its permanence. "Nobody's ever bothered to open it up," Kevin explained, noting Marcus's intense interest in the sealed cellar. The previous owners always said it was just an old root cellar that had been abandoned for safety reasons. "We're planning to excavate the whole area anyway when we start construction, so we'll probably break it open then just to make sure there's nothing structurally significant underneath." Marcus stared at the sealed entrance, his mind racing with possibilities. This had to be the cellar from the photograph. The stone walls, the location, the timeline all matched perfectly. Somewhere beneath that concrete cap lay the answers to questions that had been haunting him since he first saw those 3 terrified faces. But what if those answers were too terrible to bear? What if some secrets were meant to stay buried? As Kevin continued talking about the development plans, Marcus found himself only half listening. He was studying the sealed cellar entrance, looking for any sign of what lay beneath. The concrete appeared to be quite old, probably poured sometime in the early 1900s, based on its composition and weathering patterns. Whoever had sealed this cellar had done so with obvious permanence in mind. This wasn't a temporary measure, but a deliberate attempt to ensure that whatever was down there would never see daylight again. The sun was beginning to set as Marcus thanked Kevin and prepared to leave the site. As he walked back to his car, he took one last look at the sealed cellar entrance. In the fading light, the concrete cap looked almost like a tombstone, marking not just the burial of a structure, but perhaps the burial of truth itself. Marcus realized that he had reached a crucial decision point in his investigation. He could walk away now, file the photograph away as an interesting historical curiosity, and move on to less troubling mysteries. But as he drove away from the site, Marcus knew he couldn't abandon the investigation. The faces of Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell were etched too deeply into his memory, their silent plea for justice echoing across the decades. Whatever had happened in that cellar during the winter of 1867, it deserved to be brought to light. The boys deserved to have their story told, no matter how dark that story might prove to be. Back in his apartment that evening, Marcus spread out all the documents and photographs he had gathered, trying to make sense of the emerging pattern. The evidence pointed toward a tragedy of extraordinary proportions, but the specific details remained frustratingly elusive. What exactly had Ezekiel Hartwell done during that terrible winter? Why had he waited months before leaving the area? And most importantly, what lay beneath that concrete cap that someone had been so desperate to keep hidden? As Marcus studied the photograph one more time before going to bed, he noticed something he had missed before. In the background, barely visible in the shadows behind the three boys, there appeared to be another figure, just the suggestion of a shape that might have been a person standing in the deeper recesses of the cellar. The image was too unclear to make out any details, but its presence added another layer of mystery to an already disturbing picture. Whatever secrets you're hiding, Ezekiel Hartwell, I'm going to find them. Marcus spent the next 3 days trying to convince the development company to let him examine the sealed cellar before their construction crews broke it open. His persistence finally paid off when Kevin Mitchell called to inform him that the company president, intrigued by the historical significance of the site, had agreed to allow a careful excavation of the cellar entrance. The only condition was that Marcus would have to pay for the excavation work himself and assume all liability for what they might find. The excavation began on a crisp Thursday morning in late October. Marcus had hired a small crew, led by Tom Harrison, an experienced contractor who specialized in historical preservation work. Tom had seen plenty of old cellars and root storage areas during his career, but even he seemed uneasy as they began carefully removing the concrete cap that had sealed the entrance for over a century. The concrete was thicker than expected, nearly 8 inches deep, suggesting that whoever had poured it had been extremely determined to ensure permanent closure. As the concrete finally gave way, revealing the stone steps beneath, a rush of stale air emerged from the opening that made everyone step back in revulsion. The smell was indescribable, not the simple mustiness of an old cellar, but something far more complex and disturbing. Tom, who had encountered every kind of odor in his decades of construction work, looked genuinely shaken as he peered down into the darkness below. "I've never smelled anything quite like that," he admitted to Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like decay, but old decay. Really old." The contractor's unease was contagious, and Marcus noticed that the other crew members were reluctant to approach the opening. After allowing the cellar to air out for several hours, Tom finally agreed to descend the stone steps with Marcus, both men wearing protective gear and carrying powerful LED flashlights. The cellar was larger than Marcus had expected, roughly 15 feet square with a ceiling just high enough for a tall man to stand upright. The stone walls showed the expert craftsmanship, typical of 19th century construction. But what captured Marcus's immediate attention were the scratches he had first noticed in the photograph. They were everywhere, deep gouges in the stone that could only have been made by human fingernails, desperate scraping that spoke of unimaginable terror and hopelessness. But it was what lay on the floor that made Marcus's blood turn to ice. Scattered across the stone were small bones, clearly human and obviously belonging to children. The bones were not randomly distributed, but appeared to have been carefully arranged, almost ceremonially placed around the perimeter of the room. In the center of the cellar sat a small wooden table, its surface stained dark with what Marcus preferred not to identify. On the table lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. Tom Harrison took one look at the scene and immediately backed toward the stairs. "This is a crime scene," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to call the police right now." But Marcus, his journalistic instincts overriding his horror, approached the table and carefully opened the journal. The handwriting inside was neat and precise, belonging to someone who had maintained their sanity even while documenting the unthinkable. The first entry was dated December 15th, 1867. "The snow has been falling for 3 days," Marcus read aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "The last of the preserved food is gone. The boys are growing weaker by the day, and I fear I am losing my mind to the hunger. Sarah would never forgive me for what I am contemplating, but she is dead and buried, and I am responsible for keeping our sons alive through this terrible winter." Marcus continued reading, though each entry made him feel more nauseated. Ezekiel Hartwell's journal documented his descent into madness with horrifying clarity. The entries described his growing desperation as the winter progressed, his increasingly irrational thoughts about survival, and his gradual conviction that extreme measures were necessary to ensure that at least one member of his family would live to see spring. The journal entries revealed that Ezekiel had initially planned to take his own life, leaving what little food remained for his sons. But as the weeks passed and the boys grew weaker, he had begun to develop a different, more horrible plan. The winter had already claimed so many lives in the region that a few more deaths would hardly be noticed. If he could ensure that enough food remained for one of them to survive, wouldn't that be better than all 4 of them dying? January 3rd, 1868, Marcus read, his hands trembling as he turned the pages. "I have made my decision. Thomas is the eldest and strongest. If anyone is to survive this winter, it must be him. William and Samuel are too weak now to last much longer anyway. I have convinced them that we are playing a game, that they must stay in the cellar where it is warmer, while I search for food above. They trust me completely, as children always trust their father." The entries that followed were too horrific for Marcus to read aloud. Ezekiel Hartwell had systematically starved his 2 younger sons to death, using their bodies to feed himself and Thomas through the remainder of the winter. The journal described his methodical approach to the murders, his careful preservation of the evidence, and his growing belief that he was making a noble sacrifice for the greater good of his family line. But the most disturbing revelation came in the final entries, where Ezekiel described how Thomas had reacted to learning what his father had done. The boy had not been grateful for his survival, but had been driven mad by the knowledge of how that survival had been achieved. In his final journal entry, dated March 10th, 1868, Ezekiel wrote, "Thomas has taken his own life rather than live with the knowledge of what was done to save him. I am now alone with what I have done, and I understand that I am not the hero of this story, but its villain. I will seal this place and leave this cursed land. But first, I must ensure that the truth of what happened here is preserved, so that someday someone might understand the terrible choices that necessity demanded." Marcus closed the journal and looked around the cellar with new eyes. The bones on the floor weren't randomly scattered. They were the remains of William and Samuel Hartwell, carefully arranged by their father as a kind of shrine to his terrible deed. The stains on the table weren't just from age and moisture, but from the unspeakable acts that had taken place in this underground chamber during the winter of 1867. Tom Harrison had remained at the top of the stairs, calling down increasingly urgent suggestions that they contact the authorities immediately. But Marcus found himself frozen in place, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. This wasn't just a historical mystery. It was evidence of one of the most horrific family tragedies he had ever encountered. The photograph he had found wasn't a record of children in danger, but a document of children who were already doomed, their fate sealed by their father's descent into cannibalistic madness. As Marcus finally began to climb the stone steps back to daylight, he realized that his investigation had achieved exactly what he had hoped. He had uncovered the truth about what had happened to Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell. But the truth was far more terrible than anything he could have imagined. The boys in the photograph hadn't just been murdered. They had been sacrificed by their own father in a twisted attempt to ensure family survival that had ultimately saved no one. The drive back to Richmond passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Marcus knew he had a professional obligation to report his findings to the authorities, but he also understood that doing so would unleash a media storm that would sensationalize the Hartwell family tragedy beyond all recognition. The boys had suffered enough during their short lives. Did they deserve to have their story turned into tabloid fodder over a century after their deaths? Back in his apartment that evening, Marcus sat staring at the photograph that had started his investigation. Now that he knew the full story, the boys' expressions took on an even more heartbreaking quality. They hadn't just been afraid. They had been betrayed by the one person in the world they should have been able to trust completely. Their father's madness had robbed them not only of their lives, but of any hope that their deaths might serve some greater purpose. As Marcus contemplated his next move, he found himself thinking about Eleanor Blackthorne and why she might have hidden the photograph in her family's library. Had she known the truth about what had happened on her property? Had the Blackthorne family been keeping this secret for generations, waiting for someone like Marcus to stumble across the evidence and finally bring the truth to light? The photograph lay on his desk like an accusation, the faces of the three boys seeming to demand justice that was more than a century overdue. Marcus realized that his investigation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. He had uncovered the truth about what had happened in that cellar, but now he faced an even more challenging question. What was the right thing to do with that truth? Now I know what happened to you, but I still don't know what justice looks like after all these years. Marcus spent a sleepless night wrestling with the implications of his discovery. By dawn, he had reached a decision that would forever change his understanding of justice and responsibility. Rather than immediately contacting the authorities, he chose to return to the historical archives to search for any remaining connections between the Hartwell tragedy and the Blackthorne family. If Eleanor Blackthorne had been keeping this secret, there had to be a reason, and Marcus suspected that reason might be more complex than simple family shame. Dr. Chen met Marcus at the Historical Society early that morning, her face grave with concern, after his phone call describing what he had found in the cellar. Together, they delved deeper into the Blackthorne family records, searching for any mention of the Hartwell property or its tragic history. What they discovered painted a picture of a family that had been haunted by their connection to the Hartwell murders for more than a century. The key breakthrough came in the form of a private letter written by Eleanor's great-grandfather, Cornelius Blackthorne, to his attorney in 1923. The letter, discovered in a collection of legal documents that had been donated to the Society decades earlier, revealed that the Blackthorne family had not simply purchased the Hartwell property after the tragedy. They had been complicit in covering it up. Cornelius wrote that his father, Jonathan Blackthorne, had known exactly what Ezekiel Hartwell had done and had helped him disappear after sealing the cellar. According to the letter, Jonathan Blackthorne had been one of the few people Ezekiel had confided in during the winter of 1867. Instead of reporting the murders, Jonathan had seen an opportunity to acquire valuable farmland at a fraction of its worth. He had provided Ezekiel with money and a new identity, helping him relocate to the Western Territories, where he could start over with a clean slate. In exchange, Jonathan had purchased the property and agreed to keep the cellar sealed, ensuring that the evidence of Ezekiel's crimes would never come to light. The letter went on to describe how this secret had poisoned the Blackthorne family for generations. Each generation had passed down the knowledge of what lay beneath their property, along with the moral burden of their ancestors' complicity in covering up multiple murders. Cornelius wrote that the secret had driven his grandmother to madness and had contributed to his father's early death from what appeared to be stress-related illness. He expressed his own desire to finally reveal the truth, but admitted that doing so would destroy his family's reputation and likely result in criminal charges for his relative's role in the cover-up. Most revealing was the letter's final paragraph, where Cornelius described his decision to have the photograph of the Hartwell boys taken before their father sealed the cellar. I convinced myself that by preserving this image, I was ensuring that the boys would not be forgotten entirely, he wrote. But I now understand that I was merely creating evidence of my own cowardice, a reminder of my failure to prevent these innocent children from being erased from history along with their deaths. Marcus realized that the photograph he had found wasn't a random discovery, but a deliberate attempt by the Blackthorne family to preserve evidence of their darkest secret. Eleanor Blackthorne hadn't hidden the photograph to conceal the truth. She had hidden it to ensure that someday someone would find it and finally bring the Hartwell boys' story to light. Her years of isolation hadn't been simple reclusiveness, but a form of penance, a lifelong vigil over the terrible secret her family had helped to create. With this new understanding, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The Hartwell boys had been failed not just by their father, but by an entire community that had chosen to look the other way rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. The Blackthorne family had spent 4 generations carrying the guilt of their silence, and now that burden was passing to Marcus. He called Tom Harrison and arranged to meet him at the excavation site. The contractor had been waiting for word on how to proceed. The opened cellar entrance covered with temporary plywood, while Marcus decided on his next course of action. When Marcus arrived, he found Tom pacing nervously around the site, clearly uncomfortable with the situation he had been drawn into. "We can't just leave it like this," Tom said without preamble. "That's a crime scene down there, and we both know it. The police need to be notified. The bones need to be properly recovered and buried, and whoever's responsible for this needs to be held accountable." Marcus nodded, understanding Tom's position, but also recognizing the complexity of the situation they faced. "The person responsible has been dead for over a century," he replied quietly. "The question now is whether exposing this tragedy serves any real purpose beyond satisfying our own sense of justice. Together they descended into the cellar one final time. Marcus had brought proper equipment for photographing and documenting the scene, understanding that whatever decision he made about public disclosure, the evidence needed to be preserved. As he worked, carefully cataloging every bone and artifact, he found himself thinking about the 3 boys whose remains lay scattered around the stone floor. Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell had been robbed of their lives, their dignity, and their memory. For more than 150 years, they had been forgotten by history, their existence reduced to a few scattered bones in a sealed cellar. But they had also been preserved in that photograph, their faces captured in a moment of terror that had somehow transcended time to reach across the decades and demand justice. As Marcus completed his documentation, he made his final decision. The boys deserved to be remembered, but they also deserved to rest in peace. Rather than sensationalizing their tragedy through media exposure, he would work with local authorities to ensure proper burial for their remains, while keeping the specific details of their deaths confidential. The truth would be preserved in his documentation and in the historical record, but it would not become tabloid entertainment. Marcus contacted the county sheriff's office and reported the discovery of human remains on the property, providing a carefully edited version of events that focused on the need for proper burial rather than the sensational aspects of the case. The sheriff, a thoughtful man named Robert Hayes, agreed to handle the matter discreetly, understanding that some historical tragedies were better resolved through quiet dignity rather than public spectacle. The remains of Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell were quietly interred in the local cemetery 3 weeks later, their graves marked with a simple stone that identified them only by name and dates. Marcus arranged for the Ezekiel Hartwell's journal to be preserved in the Historical Society's archives, where it would be available to serious researchers, but protected from casual sensationalism. The photograph that had started Marcus's investigation now sat in a place of honor on his desk, but its meaning had been transformed by everything he had learned. No longer just evidence of a terrible crime, it had become a reminder of the complexity of justice and the weight of truth. The boys' faces still spoke to him across the decades, but now their message seemed different. Not a plea for vengeance, but a request for remembrance, a desire to be acknowledged as more than just victims of their father's madness. Marcus wrote a detailed account of his investigation and his findings, but he chose not to publish it. Instead, he sealed it away in his own files, along with copies of all the evidence he had gathered. Someday, perhaps, when enough time had passed and the emotional wounds had healed, the full story might be told. But for now, the truth would remain where Marcus had found it, preserved but protected, acknowledged but not exploited. The photograph of Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell would remain with Marcus for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the 3 boys who had suffered and died during that terrible winter of 1867. Their story had finally been told. Their remains had been properly laid to rest, and their memory had been preserved for future generations. In the end, Marcus realized, that might be the only justice that really mattered. Rest in peace, boys. Your story has been heard, and you will not be forgotten. 5 years after his discovery at the Hartwell farm, Marcus Whitmore continued his career as a historical investigator, but he approached his work with a deeper understanding of the responsibility that came with uncovering buried truths. The photograph of the 3 Hartwell boys remained on his desk, serving as both inspiration and warning. A reminder that some mysteries demanded not just solution, but wisdom in how those solutions were handled. The development company eventually built their subdivision on the former Hartwell property, but they honored Marcus's request to preserve a small section of land where the farmhouse had once stood. A modest memorial garden now marks the spot, with a simple plaque dedicating the space to the memory of those who suffered during the difficult years following the Civil War. Most visitors assume it's a generic tribute to historical hardship, never suspecting the specific tragedy that inspired its creation. Eleanor Blackthorne's estate was eventually settled, and Bramblewood Manor was sold to a family who converted it into a bed and breakfast. Marcus visited once, 2 years after his initial discovery, and found the house transformed by new owners who had filled it with light and warmth. The library where he had found the photograph now served as a comfortable reading room for guests, its dark history replaced by the simple pleasure of people enjoying books in a peaceful setting. The sealed files in Marcus's apartment grew thicker over the years as he encountered other mysteries that demanded similar discretion. He had learned that being a guardian of difficult truths was just as important as being their discoverer, and that the most profound victories were sometimes the ones that no one else ever knew about. The 3 boys in the photograph had taught him that justice could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest service to the dead was ensuring they could finally rest in peace. Marcus never published the story of the Hartwell tragedy, but he never forgot it either. In quiet moments, when other cases seemed overwhelming or morally ambiguous, he would look at the photograph and remember 3 children who had suffered unimaginably, but whose memory had been preserved through the dedication of strangers across multiple generations. Their faces reminded him why his work mattered, and gave him the strength to continue seeking truth in a world that didn't always want to face it. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been uncovered, and justice, in its own quiet way, had finally been served. Some stories, Marcus had learned, were too important to be left untold, but too precious to be sensationalized. The art lay in finding the balance between truth and wisdom, between remembrance and exploitation, between solving mysteries and understanding what to do with their solutions once found. In the end, Thomas, William, and Samuel Hartwell had achieved a form of immortality that their father's madness could never touch. They lived on not as victims of a sensational crime, but as symbols of innocence preserved, their story serving as a bridge between past and present that reminded future generations of both the darkness humans were capable of and the light that could emerge when that darkness was finally acknowledged and laid to rest. The photograph remained on Marcus's desk until the day he died 40 years later, at which point it was donated to the Virginia Historical Society, along with his sealed files. Dr. Chen, now elderly but still sharp, understood the significance of the bequest and ensured that the boy's story would be preserved for future historians, while remaining protected from those who might exploit it. The truth had found its proper home at last, not hidden away in shame, but preserved with dignity, waiting for the right moment and the right person to ensure it would never be forgotten. And in the quiet halls of the Historical Society, 3 boys who had died in terror during the winter of 1867 finally found the peace they had been seeking for more than a century and a half. Their faces, captured forever in that haunting photograph, continued to speak across the years, not crying out for vengeance anymore, but whispering a simple message of gratitude to those who had remembered them and honored their memory with the respect and dignity they had been denied in life.